it was taken for granted that the Iraq War would be the central issue in the 2008 election, as it was in the midterm election 2 years ago. However, it's virtually disappeared off the radar screen, which has elicited some puzzlement among the punditry. Actually, the reason is not very obscure. It was cogently explained 40 years ago when the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam was in its 4th year, and the surge of that day was about to add another 100,000 troops to the 175,000 already there, while South Vietnam was being bombed to shreds at triple the level of the bombing of the North, and the war was expanding to the rest of Indochina. However, the war was not going very well, so the former hawks were shifting towards doubts. Among them, the distinguished historian Arthur Schlesinger, maybe the most distinguished historian of his generation, a Kennedy advisor, he and other Kennedy liberals were reluctantly beginning to shift from dedication to victory to a more dovish position. And Schlesinger explained the reasons. He explained that, I'll quote him now, "Of course, we all pray that the hawks are right in thinking that the surge of that day will work, and if it does, we may all be saluting the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in winning a victory in a land that we have turned," he said, "to wreck and ruin. But the surge probably won't work at an acceptable cost to us, so perhaps strategy should be rethought." Well, the reasoning and the underlying attitudes carry over with almost no change to the critical commentary on the U.S. invasion of Iraq today. And it is a land of wreck and ruin. I've already heard a few words. I don't have to review the facts. The highly regarded British polling agency Oxford Research Bureau has just updated its estimate of deaths. Their new estimate a couple of days ago is 1.3 million. That's excluding 2 of the most violent provinces, Karbala and Anbar. On the side, it's kind of intriguing to observe the ferocity of the debate over the actual number of deaths. There's an assumption on the part of the hawks that if we only killed a couple of 100,000 people, it would be okay, so we shouldn't accept the higher estimates. You can go along with that if you like. Uncontroversially, there are over 2 million displaced within Iraq, thanks to the generosity of Jordan and Syria. The millions of refugees who have fled the wreckage of Iraq aren't totally wiped out. That includes most of the professional classes. But that welcome is fading because Jordan and Syria receive no support from the perpetrators of the crimes in Washington and London, and therefore they cannot accept that huge burden for very long. It's going to leave those 2.5 million refugees who fled in even more desperate straits. The sectarian warfare that was created by the invasion, nothing like that had ever existed before, that has devastated the country, as you know. Much of the country has been subjected to quite brutal ethnic cleansing and left in the hands of warlords and militias. That's the primary thrust of the current counterinsurgency strategy that's developed by the revered Lord Petraeus, I guess we should describe him, considering the way he's treated. He won his fame by pacifying Mosul a couple of years ago. It's now the scene of some of the most extreme violence in the country. One of the most dedicated and informed journalists who has been immersed in the ongoing tragedy Nir Rosen, has just written an epitaph entitled "The Death of Iraq" in the very mainstream and quite important journal Current History. He writes that Iraq has been killed, never to rise again. The American occupation has been more disastrous than that of the Mongols, who sacked Baghdad in the 13th century, which has been the perception of many Iraqis as well. Only fools talk of solutions now, he went on. There is no solution. The only hope is that perhaps the damage can be contained. But Iraq is, in fact, a marginal issue. And the reasons are the traditional ones, the traditional reasoning and attitudes of the liberal doves, who all pray now, as they did 40 years ago, that the hawks will be right and that the U.S. will win a victory in this land of wreck and ruin. And they're either encouraged or silenced by the good news about Iraq. And there is good news. The U.S. occupying army in Iraq, euphemistically it's called the Multinational Force Iraq, because they have, I think, 3 poles there somewhere, the occupying army carries out extensive studies of popular attitudes. It's an important part of counterinsurgency or any form of domination. You want to know what your subjects are thinking. And it released a report last December. It was a study of focus groups, and it was uncharacteristically upbeat. The report concluded, I'll quote it, that the survey of focus groups provides very strong evidence that national reconciliation is possible and anticipated, contrary to what's being claimed. The survey found that a sense of optimistic possibility permeated all focus groups, and far more commonalities than differences are found among these seemingly diverse groups of Iraqis from all over the country and all walks of life. This discovery of shared beliefs among Iraqis throughout the country is good news, according to a military analysis of the results. Karen DeYoung reported in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago. Well, the shared beliefs are identified in the report. I'll quote DeYoung. Iraqis of all sectarian and ethnic groups believe that the U.S. military invasion is the primary root of the violent differences among them and see the departure of what they call occupying forces as the key to national reconciliation. So those are the shared beliefs. According to the Iraqis, then, there's hope of national reconciliation if the invaders, who are responsible for the internal violence and the other atrocities, if they withdraw and leave Iraq to Iraqis. That's pretty much the same as what's been found in earlier polls, so it's not all that surprising. Well, that's the good news, shared beliefs. The report didn't mention some other good news, so I'll add it. Iraqis, it appears, accept the highest values of Americans. That ought to be good news. Specifically, they accept the principles of the Nuremberg Tribunal that sentenced Nazi war criminals to hanging for such crimes as supporting aggression and preemptive war. It was the main charge against von Ribbentrop, for example, whose position was in the Nazi regime was that of Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. The tribunal defined aggression very straightforwardly. Aggression, in its words, is the invasion of its armed forces by one state of the territory of another state. That's simple. Obviously, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan are textbook examples of aggression. And the tribunal, as I'm sure you know, went on to characterize aggression as the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself all the accumulated evil of the whole. So everything that follows from the aggression is part of the evil of the aggression. Well, the good news from the U.S. military survey of focus groups is that Iraqis do accept the Nuremberg principles. They understand that sectarian violence and the other post-war horrors are contained within the supreme international crime committed by the invaders. I think they were not asked whether their acceptance of American values extends to the conclusion of Justice Robert Jackson, Chief Prosecutor for the United States at Nuremberg. He forcefully insisted that the tribunal would be mere farce if we do not apply the principles to ourselves. Well, needless to say, U.S. opinion, shared with the West generally, flatly rejects the lofty American values that were professed at Nuremberg, indeed regards them as bordering on obscene, as you could quickly discover if you try experimenting by suggesting that these values should be observed, as Iraqis insist. It's an interesting illustration of the reality, some of the reality that lies behind the famous clash of civilizations. Maybe not exactly the way we like to look at it. There was a poll a few days ago, really a major poll, just released, which found that 75% of Americans believe that U.S. foreign policy is driving the dissatisfaction with America abroad, and more than 60% believe that dislike of American values and of the American people are also to blame. Dissatisfaction is a kind of an understatement. The United States has become increasingly the most feared and often hated country in the world. Well, that perception is in fact incorrect. It's fed by propaganda. There's very little dislike of Americans in the world, shown by repeated polls, and the dissatisfaction, that is the hatred and the anger, they come from acceptance of American values, not rejection of them, and recognition that they're rejected by the U.S. government and by U.S. elites, which does lead to hatred and anger. There's other good news that's been reported by General Petraeus and Ambassador Ryan Crocker. That was during the extravaganza that was staged last September 11th. September 11th. Might ask why the timing. Well, a cynic might imagine that the timing was intended to insinuate the Bush-Cheney claims of links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. They can't come out and say it straight out, so therefore you sort of insinuate it by devices like this. It's intended to indicate, as they used to say outright, but are now too embarrassed to say, except maybe Cheney, that by committing the supreme international crime, they were defending the world against terror, which in fact increased sevenfold as a result of the invasion, according to a recent analysis by terrorism specialists Peter Bergen and Paul Cruikshank. Petraeus and Crocker provided figures to explain the good news. The figures they provided on September 11th showed that the Iraqi government was greatly accelerating spending on reconstruction, which is good news indeed, and remained so until it was investigated by the Government Accountability Office, which found that the actual figure was 1/6 of what Petraeus and Crocker reported, and in fact a 50% decline from the previous year. Well, more good news is the decline in sectarian violence. That's attributable in part to the murderous ethnic cleansing that Iraqis blame on the invasion. The result of it is there are simply fewer people to kill, so sectarian violence declines. It's also attributable to the new counterinsurgency doctrine, Washington's decision to support the tribal groups that had already organized to drive out Iraqi al-Qaeda, to an increase in U.S. troops, and to the decision of the Sadr's Mahdi army to consolidate its gains, to stop direct fighting and work politically. That's what the press calls halting aggression by the Mahdi army. Notice that only Iraqis can commit aggression in Iraq. or Iranians, of course, but no one else. Well, it's possible that Petraeus' strategy may approach the success of the Russians in Chechnya, where, I'll quote the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, Chechnya, the fighting is now limited and sporadic, and Grozny is in the midst of a building boom after having been reduced to rubble by the Russian attack. Well, maybe someday Baghdad and Fallujah also will enjoy, continue the quote, electricity restored in many neighborhoods, new businesses opening, and the city's main streets repaved, as in booming Grozny. Possible, but dubious in the light of the likely consequence of creating warlord armies that may be the seeds of even greater sectarian violence, adding to the accumulated evil of the aggression. Well, if Russians share the beliefs and attitudes of elite liberal intellectuals in the West, then they must be praising Putin's wisdom and statesmanship for his achievements in Chechnya. Formerly, they turned into a land of wreck and ruin and are now rebuilding. Great achievement. A few days ago, the New York Times, the military and Iraq expert of the New York Times, Michael Gordon, wrote a comprehensive review, first-page comprehensive review, of the options for Iraq that are being faced by the candidates. And he went through them in detail, described the pluses and minuses and so on, interviewing political leaders, candidates, experts, etc. There was one voice missing, Iraqis. Their preference is not rejected, rather it's not mentioned. And it seems that there was no notice of that fact, which makes sense because it's typical. It makes sense on the tacit assumption that underlies almost all discourse on international affairs. The tacit assumption, without which none of it makes any sense, is that we own the world. And so what does it matter what others think? They're unpeople, nice term invented by British diplomatic historian Michael Curtis. He's done a series of outstanding volumes on Britain's crimes of empire, outstanding work, therefore deeply hidden. So there are the unpeople out there, and then there are the owners, that's us, and we don't have to listen to the unpeople.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking in Arlington, Massachusetts. We'll come back to that speech in a minute here on Democracy Now!, and you can get a copy of the speech at democracynow.org. Stay with us.
There's no time to beat around the bush. All the world is living in fear. The consequence of great disasters on that alone I cannot bear. And now that war has raised its ugly head, all I can predict is woe. This claim for power paints the city red. I isolate the status quo. And we don't want no weapons, no way of mass destruction. And we don't want no weapons of mass destruction.
No more weapons, Steel Pulse and Damian Marley here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we return to Professor Noam Chomsky. Teaches linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology for over half a century. Noam Chomsky is the author of more than 100 books on U.S. foreign policy. He was speaking before a packed audience in Arlington, Massachusetts.
Last month, Panama declared a day of mourning to commemorate the U.S. invasion. It's under George Bush #1. It killed thousands of poor Panamanians, when the U.S. bombed the El Chorrillo slums, other poor areas. So Panamanian human rights organizations claim. We don't actually know because we never count our crimes. Victors don't do that, only the defeated. It aroused no interest here. There's barely a mention of the day of mourning. There's also no interest in the fact that Bush I's invasion of Panama was a clear case of aggression to which the Nuremberg principles apply. And it was apparently more deadly, in fact, possibly much more deadly than Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait happened a few months later. But it makes sense that there would be no interest in that because we own the world and Saddam didn't. So the acts are quite different. It's also of no interest that at that time, at the time of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, the greatest fear in Washington was that Saddam would imitate what the United States had just done in Panama, namely install a client government and then leave. It's the main reason why Washington blocked diplomacy in quite interesting ways, with almost complete media cooperation. There's actually one exception in the U.S. media. But none of this gets any commentary. However, it does merit a lead story a few days later, when the Panamanian National Assembly was opened by President Pedro Gonzalez, who's charged by Washington with killing 2 American soldiers during a protest against President Bush #1, against his visit 2 years after the invasion. The charges were dismissed by Panamanian courts, but they're upheld by the owner of the world, so he can't travel, and that got a story. Well, to take just one last illustration of the depth of the imperial mentality, New York Times correspondent Elaine Sciolino, veteran correspondent, writes that Iran's intransigence about nuclear enrichment appears to be defeating attempts by the rest of the world to curtail Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Well, the phrase "the rest of the world" is an interesting one. The rest of the world happens to exclude the vast majority of the world, namely the non-aligned movement, which forcefully endorses Iran's right to enrich uranium in accordance with the rights granted by its being a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But they're not part of the world, even though they're the large majority, because they don't reflexively accept U.S. orders, and commentary like that is unremarkable and unnoticed. You're part of the world if you do what we say, obviously. Otherwise, you're unpeople. Well, we might, since we're on Iran, might tarry for a moment, ask whether there's any solution to the U.S.-Iran confrontation over nuclear weapons, which is extremely dangerous. Here's one idea. First point, Iran should be permitted to develop nuclear energy, but not nuclear weapons, as the Non-Proliferation Treaty determines. A second point is that there should be a nuclear weapons-free zone in the entire region, Iran to Israel, including any U.S. forces that are present there. Actually, though it's never reported, the United States is committed to that position. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it appealed to a UN resolution, Resolution 687, which called upon Iraq to eliminate its weapons of mass destruction. That was the flimsy legal principle invoked to justify the invasion. And if you look at Resolution 687, you discover that one of its provisions is that the U.S. and other powers must work to develop a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, including that entire region. So we're committed to it. And that's the second element of this proposal. The third element of the proposal is that the United States should accept the Non-Proliferation Treaty. a position which happens to be supported by 82% of Americans, namely that it should accept the requirement, in fact a legal requirement as the World Court determined, to make good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether. And a fourth proposal is that the U.S. should turn to diplomacy and it should end any threats against Iran. The threats are themselves crimes. They're in violation of the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force. Well, of course, these four proposals, again, Iran should have nuclear energy but not nuclear weapons. There should be a weapons-free zone throughout the region. The U.S. should accept the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There should be a turn to diplomacy and an end to threats. These are almost unmentionable in the United States. Not a single candidate would endorse any part of them, and they're never discussed, and so on. However, the proposals are not original. They happen to be the position of the overwhelming majority of the American population. And interestingly, that's also true in Iran. Roughly the same overwhelming majority accepts all of these proposals. But the results come from the world's most prestigious polling agency, but not reported as far as I could discover, and certainly not considered. If they were ever mentioned, they would be dismissed with the phrase politically impossible, which is probably correct. It's only the position of the large majority of the population, kind of like national health care, but not of the people who count. So there are plenty of unpeople here, too. In fact, the large majority. Americans share this property of being unpeople with most of the rest of the world. In fact, if the United States and Iran were functioning, not merely formal democracies, then this dangerous crisis might be readily resolved by a functioning democracy. I mean, one in which public opinion plays some role in determining policy, rather than being excluded, in fact unmentioned, because after all they're unpeople. Well, while we're on Iran, I guess I might as well turn to the third member of the famous axis of evil, North Korea. There is an official story, read it right now, is that the official story is this, that after having been compelled to accept an agreement on dismantling its nuclear weapons and the facilities, after having been compelled to agree to that, North Korea is again trying to evade its commitments its usual devious way. So the New York Times headline on this 10 days ago reads, United States sees stalling by North Korea on nuclear pact. And the article then details the charges of how North Korea is not going through with its responsibility. It's not releasing information that it's promised to release. If you read the story to the last paragraph, and that's always a good idea, that's where the interesting news usually is when you read a news story. But if you manage to get to the last paragraph, you discover that it's the United States that has backed down on the pledges made in the agreement. The United States had promised to provide 1 million tons of fuel, and what do I do? I couldn't see, I'm sorry.
10 minutes.
I should hurry up? Yeah. Okay. All right, just start screaming at me if I go on too long. The U.S. just refused to supply it. It supplied only 85% of the fuel that it promised. And it was supposed to improve diplomatic relations, of course not doing that. Well, that's quite normal. You want to find out what's going on in the U.S.-North Korea nuclear standoff, it's better, you have to go to the specialist literature, which is uniform on it, nothing hidden, and in fact sort of sneaks out in the small print in the press reports, as I mentioned. What you find is that North Korea may be the most hideous state in the world, but that's not the point here. Its position has been pretty pragmatic. It's kind of tit for tat. The United States gets more aggressive, they get more aggressive. The United States moves towards diplomacy and negotiations, they do the same. So when President Bush came in, there was an agreement. It's called the Framework Agreement that had been established in 1994. Neither the United States nor North Korea was quite living up to it, but it was more or less functioning. At that time, North Korea, under the framework agreement, had stopped any testing of long-range missiles. It had maybe 1 or 2 bombs worth of plutonium, and it was verifiably not making more. That was when George Bush entered the scene. And now it has 8 to 10 bombs, long-range missiles, and it's developing plutonium. And there's a reason. The Bush regime immediately moved to a very aggressive stance. The axis of evil speech was one example. Intelligence was released claiming that North Korea was was cheating, had clandestine programs. So it's rather interesting that these intelligence reports 5 years later have been quietly rescinded as probably inadequate. The reason, presumably, is that if an agreement is reached, there will be inspectors in North Korea, and they'll find that this intelligence had as much validity as the claims about Iraq, so they're being withdrawn. Well, North Korea responded to all of this by ratcheting up its missile and weapons development. In September 2005, under pressure, the United States did agree to negotiations, and there was an outcome. September 2005, North Korea agreed to abandon, quoting, all nuclear weapons and existing weapons programs, and to allow international inspection. That would be in return for international aid, mainly from the United States, and a non-aggression pledge from the U.S., and an agreement that the two sides, I'm quoting, would respect each other's sovereignty, exist peacefully together, and take steps to normalize relations. Well, the United States, the Bush administration, had an instant reaction. It instantly renewed the threat of force. It froze North Korean funds in foreign banks. It disbanded the consortium that was supposed to meet to provide North Korea with a light water reactor. So North Korea returned to its weapons and missile development, carried out a weapons test, and confrontation escalated. Well, again, under international pressure and with its foreign policy collapsing, Washington returned to negotiations that led to an agreement which Washington is now scuttling. There's an earlier history, an interesting one. You recall a couple of weeks ago there was a mysterious Israeli bombing in northern Syria, never explained, but it sort of hinted that this had something to do with Syria building the nuclear facilities with help of North Korea. It's pretty unlikely, but whether it's true or not, there's an interesting background which wasn't mentioned. In 1993, Israel and North Korea were on the verge of an agreement in which Israel would recognize North Korea, and in return North Korea would agree to terminate any weapons-related, missile, nuclear, or other, any weapons-related activity in the Middle East. That would have been an enormous boon to Israel's security, but the owner of the world stepped in. Clinton ordered them to refuse. And of course, you have to listen to the master's voice. So that ended that. And it may be that there are North Korean activities in the Middle East that we don't know about. Well, let me finally return to the first member of the axis of evil, Iraq. Washington does have expectations, and they're explicit. They're outlined in a declaration of principles that was agreed upon, if you can call it that, between the United States and the U.S.-backed, U.S.-installed Iraqi government under military occupation. The two of them issued the Declaration of Principles. It allows U.S. forces to remain indefinitely in Iraq in order to deter foreign aggression. Well, the only aggression in sight is from the United States, but that's not aggression by definition. And also to facilitate and encourage the flow of foreign investments in Iraq, especially American investments. I'm quoting. That's an unusually brazen expression of imperial will. Actually, it was heightened a few days ago when George Bush issued another one of his signing statements declaring that he will reject crucial provisions of congressional legislation that he had just signed, including the provision that forbids spending taxpayer money, I'm quoting, to establish any military installation or base for the purpose of providing for the permanent stationing of U.S. armed forces in Iraq, or to exercise U.S. control of the oil resources of Iraq. Okay? Shortly after, the New York Times reported that Washington insists, if you own the world, you insists that the Baghdad government give the United States broad authority to conduct combat operations, a demand that faces a potential buzzsaw of opposition from Iraq with its deep sensitivities about being seen as a dependent state. It's supposed to be more third world irrationality. So in brief, the United States is now insisting that Iraq must agree to allow permanent U.S. military installations, grant the United States the right to conduct combat operations freely, and to guarantee U.S. control over the oil resources of Iraq. Okay? It's all very explicit on the table. It's kind of interesting that these reports do not elicit any reflection on the reasons why the United States invaded Iraq. You've heard those reasons offered, but they were dismissed with ridicule. Now they're openly conceded to be accurate, but not eliciting any retraction or even any reflection. Well, there's a lot more to say about good news, but I was told to shut up, so I will. Just say that thinking about these things really does give some insight into the famous clash of civilizations. And its actual substance, topics that really ought to be foremost in our minds, I believe. Thanks.